Welcome to Module 2, Social Technologies in Virtual Education. This week, we're going to explore more deeply the use of social technologies in your virtual lessons and activities. And we're going to talk about how those social technologies can be used most effectively and efficiently. So last week, we highlighted social technologies as a way to collaborate and communicate and perhaps even assess your students. Well, this week we're going to dive in and talk more specifically about how you can build lessons around these tools and how they can actually more deeply engage your students and hopefully more effectively enable them to achieve the objectives you set forth. Now, since social technologies is a broad phrase, and we can use it to refer to all sorts of different technologies and tools, I thought I would share specifically what we're going to be highlighting in this class as social technologies. This list is not exhaustive. There are hundreds of different tools out there. In fact, I'm sure there are different tools and technologies in your various countries that aren't on this list. I've included on this list some of the more popular tools and technologies being used and the ones that have some really good rich examples that people have shared about how to use these technologies. But by no means is this an exhaustive list, as I said, and I would love it if you all have other technologies that you're interested in using or would encourage others to use for you to share those within the discussions in this class and let me know so I can include them in our conversations. So now I consider there to be sort of two buckets of this subset of social technologies that are being used in education. First bucket are those technologies that are focused on networking and sharing. So it's about posting out ideas and reflecting on those ideas and then having the community give you feedback on those ideas. And those things range from anywhere from Twitter and Facebook through to tools that allow you to show your work, not just your text ideas. So things like YouTube, Vimeo, Flickr, and SlideShare, where you can produce things and share them with the community, and the community can comment on those things that you're producing. Now, on another bucket that I think is important to think about when we're talking about how to use social technologies in virtual K-12 education are blogs and wikis, or this idea of either creating collective work through wikis or creating more journal type or blog type work and then sharing that with the community for their commenting. So we're going to talk about a number of these tools. And in fact, in the subsequent lectures, we're going to briefly go into 6 of these tools, talk about a few kinds of lessons, and then do a little quick tour of the tool so that for those of you that have never used them, you're a little more familiar with how those tools may work or those technologies may work and how you may want to incorporate them in your class. Now, please note that on this slide, I have an asterisk next to it, almost the majority of the technologies. Well, that's because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on the appropriateness that you think of the technology to children, these technologies are only available to children in the U.S. 13 and older. Now, in other countries, there actually may be an older age limit. I know in some Asian countries, it may be even 14 or 15. So just bear in mind that many of the examples we're going to talk through probably are only relevant to your high school students or your, the students in their latter years in your educational system. So before we get into those specific technologies in our separate lectures, let's talk a little bit about when to use a social technology and when not to use a social technology. Now, these ideas are collected from teachers all around the world having experimented with social technologies and seen successes and, unfortunately, some failures. So first and foremost, you should only be using a social technology when you yourself have used it. Now, it could be personal reasons that you've used it. It doesn't have to be in a professional or academic setting. But you should be fluent in that technology because the last thing you want are students to uncover ways that they can use the technology in either unproductive or unfair ways because you weren't as familiar with the technology as you should be. But I think we would all do that anyway. So you also want to make sure you're fluent in its privacy controls. And there's some great updates to a lot of these technologies that allow for the use of them in your educational settings to be very controlled, which is pretty exciting. You also want to make sure that you've determined a learning objective. You're starting with your learning objective, and then you're just deciding how you're going to evaluate that learning objective, much like a backward design process, and then you're building your activity through which you will select a social technology to support that activity. But I really want to emphasize it's important to start with the learning objective, because if you want to use a technology just because you want to use it, that will definitely be noticeable by your students. They will feel like we're just using it, it doesn't really matter. And so their participation could either not be the way you would like it to be, they're not reflecting or commenting on the things you want them to, or they might not even participate at all. You also want to make sure that learning objective is centered on social interaction or social sharing or collaboration, because the social technologies aren't ideal for activities that aren't about having the community interact or talk or give feedback. They can be used as just a way to produce work to send to you as the teacher, but that's not the ideal way. There's other tools that are much more efficient and effective in doing that. So really looking for things that are about being social. You want to make sure it's appropriate for your age group, as we've mentioned, and you want to make sure you have some really clear examples of how to use the technology academically or in the particular lesson that you're having students do. And you want to make sure you give them a specific time in which they're using that technology. Now, that time could be as short as a half an hour, could be as long as your entire class duration, 10, 12 weeks, a year, whatever it might be. But knowing that that's the duration that the students should be participating, being very explicit with that, what they're trying to accomplish using that technology, and once again, good examples of what good use is, then you'll be able to direct your students to that technology or tool in effective ways. Now, when not to use the social technology. I personally think you need to be very careful when the social technology forces your students to share things publicly that you don't necessarily want them to share and that they don't want to share publicly, and it forces themselves to mix personal and academic activities. So if there's ways to segregate those, either through different accounts or different pages or different communities, I highly suggest it, because that way students don't feel as though one's invading the other. And it also can protect them from themselves. That said, I was working with a couple of students last week, and in talking to them about how they like to use social technologies in their lessons, they shared that there's sometimes they do like sharing things broader, more publicly, because they're curious to get feedback from others, adults, people outside of their community, outside of their class. But I think those are very selective situations that you can do that, and once again, it should be an optional thing. In fact, in this case, these students were doing writing activities, and they wanted to be writers, so they were opening themselves up to the broader professional writing field as a way to get some feedback about how they can evolve or the kinds of things they need to work on to be writers. So it's a good example of when it's okay to be public, but once again, I encourage you to be careful. You also want to make sure that the particular technology or tool can be used across devices, so laptops, different kinds of tablets, different kinds of phones. I was trying to say iPhone, but we all have Androids and all sorts of other things out there. So make sure that students can access it across multiple devices, or if it is a device-specific thing, you do have a one-to-one program where students have that particular kind of device. And then finally, you want to make sure you're not using a social technology that actually slows your lesson down that you don't want it to, or that it distracts from the learning objectives. It's too interesting, it's too fun to use the technology, and the learning objectives aren't being met. Now, I do have a question for you to think about. Lots of people talk about social technologies as a method to just engage students more deeply in activity. So here's my question for you. Is it enough to use a social technology merely to just engage students? Or do you need to have another reason for using a social technology, like a further acquisition of a topic or content? Perhaps it deepens that learning. Perhaps it helps them produce more knowledge. Perhaps it teaches them social citizenship. Or, once again, is engagement enough? Now, there's a whole debate in the community, and people argue either way, so I'd like you to think about how you feel. Is engagement enough to use a social technology? Now, as you're reflecting, now let's talk a little bit about what might specifically be a case of using a social technology. So I'm teaching a third grade class, And my lessons focused on electricity. In fact, one of my learning objectives is to have students explore the world around me. What should I make sure I avoid when selecting a social technology to support this lesson? So now that you've thought about that, we want to make sure we don't forget about effectiveness and efficiency. So yes, we want to use social technologies to produce better learning experiences for students so they grow in your particular discipline or in your particular class in the direction you want them to. But we also need to make sure for ourselves that we use them effectively and efficiently. So if we talk about effectiveness, a couple of key things to remember about social technologies in general. First of all, they can share more than just text. And having students produce things more than just text can often be a great way to encourage creativity, and it can also be a great way to expose students to all sorts of different types of medium that they may be using in their further education or even in their workplace. So social technologies, remember, can incorporate images, videos, links, curation of content, presentations, collaborative documents, and all sorts of other things. So encourage them, find places where it's more than just text. Although text is great, especially if you're working on writing skills, but think about using other resources as well. Also, it's important to remember that each social technology has its own style, and you want to use it to your advantage. We're going to talk in the individual lectures through each of the examples of social technologies about what that style is. And then finally, you want to remember that social technologies are social. So as I mentioned before, independent exchange of or independent submission of work isn't necessarily the best way to use a social technology. In fact, it may end up slowing you down or being more cumbersome to grade or evaluate than another type of tool used for homework submission type activities is appropriate for. Finally, when you're thinking about particularly creating content that's different than text, having devices that have have cameras and video cameras incorporated in them makes it a lot quicker and easier for students to be able to videotape work, take pictures of things, and quickly load them into those technologies. If you're having students use a different camera and then they have to upload that document or that picture or that video, that can take extra time and that can take time away from the lesson. So if you have the advantage of having devices that have those built-in tools, try to use those. Now, what about efficiency? One important thing to remember is you don't have to comment on every post. I know this is an obvious statement, but I think a lot of us as teachers, when we get in, even I did this when I got into us working on this course together, I wanted to look at every post and I wanted to comment, and I had to remind myself that we don't have the bandwidth or the scale to do that. So if you want to, you can. If you've got the scale, you can. And I do encourage you to try to be responsive and really monitoring students the first time they use a particular social technology in your class. But remember, it's about the community interacting, not you interacting with individual students at all times. You can use social technologies to not only support a lesson or a learning activity, but to support the administration of those activities. So you can crowdsource support across your class or even across grades. Students are asking each other how to use something while they're trying to do a particular academic exercise in your class. It can be a great place to have students do that and help one another. You can also think about separating your own accounts, or really, as I mentioned before, being able to aggregate together what you're doing in your classes versus what you're doing in your personal life in those technologies so that you don't have an oops moment as well. You also want to structure your own timing around using these social technologies so that you're more frequently visible, because that's how you keep the momentum going in these technologies quite often, as opposed to choosing to spend 4 hours one day a week and going through everything. Students want to be encouraged to be regularly participative. That's a great reason to use a social technology. So you need to be in there more frequently, but you can be in there for much shorter periods of time. And then finally, I've alluded to this in a couple of other cases, but you want to make sure that you're aggregating, you're filtering, you're subscribing, you're doing whatever you need to do in order to manage your technologies really efficiently. So there are things like Hootsuite and other aggregators out there that if you're going to use multiple social technologies across multiple classes, you can aggregate all of that together, communicate to all of them at once, and make your life a lot more efficient. Look for those, or if you need to get emails and you want to subscribe to everything, do that. But figure out your best approach for monitoring these tools so that you can be frequently visible, yet not have to spend long periods of time working with the work that students have produced. So with that, one last question to think about. As we're thinking about using these social technologies, particularly in virtual settings where students are 13 to 18, because we know that's where many of these technologies can be used, what should we make sure we're trying to do? How do we want to use those technologies most effectively? All right, so in the next series of very short lectures, you're going to see examples, lesson examples, highlights from how you can use very specific technologies. And we're going to highlight 6 of those. So I hope you enjoy.